In breaking news today, a YouTuber made another video. All right, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back. So today I want to talk about 5 books that have radically changed my life. So first off, we have Mate, Become the Man Women Want by Tucker Max and Jeffrey Miller. One of my favorite quotes from the book is, willpower is really just being as kind as you can be to the man you want to become. So the way I think about this book is that it is sort of a condensed version of all the self-help books that are out there. It is incredibly actionable, and it's also cutting through the fluff. You know, there's been books written on meditation, there's been books written on nutrition, but this book takes the wisdom from all of those books and from the research Jeffrey Miller's done and from Tucker Max's firsthand experience. It puts it all neatly into one very easily digestible book, and this book explains everything in a way that pretty much anyone can understand. I don't think there's a better book on personal development for men and really women, even though it's kind of marketed towards men, in the ages of 15 to 30, 35 with today's levels of maturity. And I love that it doesn't kind of bullshit you. They're not trying to sugarcoat anything. They're just like, listen, here is the most up-to-date information on this topic. Here's why it works. And they back a lot of it up through evolutionary perspectives and evolutionary studies. Now, a great companion to this book is the Mating Grounds podcast. And I remember I was in college and I stumbled upon the Mating Grounds podcast. And I sent it to my brother, who's 4 years older than me. And after I listened to a couple episodes and he listened to a couple episodes, we kind of touched base. We both had the same thing to say, which was, holy shit, I have felt everything that they are talking about my whole life, and I just didn't know how to put it into words. And not surprisingly, after 6-7 months of listening to it, I thought to myself, you know what? I can't possibly take all of this information in and keep going to college. And so I dropped out and I moved to Austin. Final thoughts on that book and the podcast is that it's probably the single best podcast I've ever listened to in my life, and also just very educational. Book number 2, One Last Talk by Philip McKernan. And my favorite quote here is, everyone wants to give back. And the best way to give back is to connect with their pain, connect with their truth, and to speak it, and to thus help others experiencing the same pain. So right off the bat, what I'm gonna say is that everyone I've recommended this book to either reads it, but doesn't do the exercises in the book, or does not finish reading it. And when I read it, it was challenging. It took a lot from me to actually sit down and do the stuff this book was asking me to do, because it's digging through my emotional history in a way that no other book to this day has been able to. The way Philip talks about his book and about just this whole process of a one last talk is that people love to care for external causes. People care for the environment. People care about rescuing animals. But what a lot of people neglect is actually our own cause. So what I mean by that, for about 22, 23 years of my life, I was holding this secret I was very ashamed of. And it wasn't until I read this book and I wrote my first memoir about that secret that my life actually began. Whereas before, I thought this was gonna be the end of me. Once I connected to it and I understood why that happened and I let go of some of the shame and the guilt, I realized like, oh, actually this is a treasure. And I am not the only person that has experienced this or that is afraid of other people finding this out about them. So by me connecting with that and then sharing it with the world, other people in my situation, they can consume that and automatically they will know that at least they're not alone. There's so many light bulb aha moments in this book where it's just, you know, you're reading something and you're like, of course, how did I not think about that before? And if nothing else, just the exercises alone in this are worth the money and worth the time. One of my favorite exercises in the book was actually to write a one last letter. If you knew you were going to die tomorrow and you only could write one letter, what would that letter say? And who would you write it to? Right? You don't have to show it to anybody. You don't have to share it online. Nobody has to read this. But the process of doing that, at least for me, helped me to kind of separate all the bullshit and actually hone in on like, all right, what is that the biggest thing that if I died tomorrow, I would regret? The last thing I'll say about this book is that in combination with the exercises I did and the memoir that I wrote, and then a follow-up conversation I actually had with the author on my podcast, transformed my relationship with my dad. Without those three things, he would just kind of be like a tangential part of my life. All right, next we have Letting Go by David R. Hawkins. And one of my favorite quotes from this one is, "The basic dictum to comprehend is that the body obeys the mind. Therefore, the body tends to manifest what the mind believes." So the concept in this book is basically that we have been programmed throughout our life, not just in our time, but everybody goes through this, right? Everybody receives programming as they grow up that is consciously or unconsciously forced on them. Sometimes it's teachers that are just doing what they think is best, and sometimes it is like, crazy government level psyops that are trying to control people. So what is programming? What are programs? There's actually a quote in the book that explains it perfectly, and it says, "The thought that everybody's got a cold will be subscribed to by a person who feels sufficient guilt, fear, and naivete regarding the laws of consciousness. Because of unconscious guilt, a person consciously feels that they deserve a cold. The body obeys the mind's belief that colds are caused by viruses, which are catching and contagious. Thus, the body, which is controlled by the mind's belief, manifests the cold. The paradoxical effect is that fearful thoughts are reinforced and given so much power that epidemics are actually created by the media." So again, I'm not here to convince you. I'm not here to tell you that this is right and that you're wrong, but this has worked for me, and it has transformed the way that I relate to the word sick or the word virus or anything in that sort of realm of disease. So then how do you let go of a program? To let go basically means to surrender. And surrendering means relinquishing a feeling by allowing ourselves just to experience it without trying to change it. Another great quote from the book is, "When letting go, it's not helpful to think about the technique. It's better simply just to do it. Feeling doesn't need to have a label. It just needs to happen." And I get, this is a big leap, especially if it's kind of your first time running into this concept. It can be a big leap to say like, oh, what? So viruses are a program, and then, what else is a program, right? But that's kind of where the magic happened for me. Used to have a recurring tonsil problem every single year from the time that I moved to Austin, where I would just get fucking strep throat or tonsillitis or something else that the doctors didn't know what to call. And then I decided, hey, maybe there's a reason that this is happening, and maybe it's not just the way doctors said, a random occurrence. And ever since I decided to reframe my tonsils problem into a message from my body, now anytime I start to feel a little tingle in the back of my throat, I'm like, oh, I'm either not sleeping enough, I'm stressed out at work, or I'm stressed out in a relationship in my life. And every single time, one of those turns out to be the case. So to close out this book, there's another great quote that I love, and it says, "A common phenomenon among people who are growing in consciousness is that we are not aware of all the coal that we have shoveled. We are always looking at the shovelful we are handling right now." Book number 4, When the Body Says No by Gabor Mate. And this one's very, very much in line with Letting Go. I actually read them at at the same time. One of my favorite quotes goes, "For some people, it is disease that finally shatters the illusion of control." So again, going back to my tonsil story is, I thought I could control in my relationships. I thought I could control my emotions. I thought I could control just everything in my fucking life. And my problem with my tonsils came in at the times in my life when I was being the most controlling, which was stressing me out, to remind me that, hey, you don't actually have control here, and it would behoove you to let go. The premise in this book is that there is a potential link between disease and emotions and stress. Gabor says, when you don't pay attention to the emotional signals, your body says, okay, here are some physical signals for you. If you don't pay attention to them either, then you're in deep trouble. Brief example on this is my dad. Currently, he has been undergoing cancer treatment for upwards of 6 months. And for about 6 years before that, every time I would call him on the phone, he would tell me that his shoulder hurt, his back hurt. When I went to visit him, he had a problem with his discs. He's got diabetes, right? He's got all of these physical signals that his body is trying to send him. But because he has been ignoring them for so long, his body was like, well, hey, maybe potentially terminal brain cancer might get him to listen, right? The most impactful idea in this book is that our body knows what it's doing. And now, because this book is dealing with emotions and a lot of this trauma, it does go into like childhood stuff a lot, which I love. And one of my favorite quotes on trauma from this book is, the young human being unconsciously banishes from awareness feelings or information that, if consciously experienced, would create unsolvable problems. That quote alone completely reframed the way I view addiction and the way that I understand my childhood. Book number 5 and the final one in this video is No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. One of my favorite quotes from this one is, many medical symptoms are at least exacerbated or initiated by our parts when they can't get through to us directly. The more we don't listen, the more severe the symptom. What I've found, the more I read about trauma, the more I read self-help, is that everything at the end of the day comes back to feeling emotions. But so this book does go specifically more into IFS, which is internal family systems. And what IFS is trying to get at its core is that we're all sort of split into different parts. And the more aware we can become of our parts, the more whole we become, and the less that we allow those parts to control us. Who I think this book is most groundbreaking for is actually people diagnosed with multiple personality disorders or bipolar or schizophrenia or all that kind of stuff, right? Because the more I read this book, the more I realized like there's not really that big of a difference between somebody who's been diagnosed bipolar or schizophrenic and say someone like me, right? There's this tendency to look at those diagnoses from other people and be like, oh wow, that's wild that they went on this manic episode and did this, or that they fell into a dark pit of depression or whatever. And it's like, okay, but I don't see a difference between a manic episode and the times in my life where maybe I was going through a lot of pain and I just spent way more money than I had in a very short period of time. The premise of this book is that that is happening not because of a diagnosis, but because that part of us is taking over. There's a lot of conversations in the book that the author has with clients, and there's one that was especially impactful to me during a mushroom trip. In that conversation in the book, he's doing IFS with a suicidal person, and he says, instead of looking at this as a negative, as a problem, how about we try and understand it? So he walks the person through this whole exercise, which then I did during my mushroom trip. And once I asked myself, okay, why am I having these images? Instead of trying to get rid of them, that part of me felt like, oh shit, you're listening? So think about it as like a kid that isn't getting what he wants. Is that kid going to stop throwing a tantrum, or is he just going to escalate it until his parents tune in to what he needs? And when I tuned in to that suicidal part of me, what I realized was like, oh, it has gotten so severe and it wants to hurt me because it feels rejected. It feels like I am not listening. So this is the only thing it feels it has left in order to reach me. So that's it. Those are the 5 books. And the last thing I'll say about just reading self-help books in general is that if I don't do anything with the information that I learn, these books would not have served me, right? So reading the books in and of itself is not going to heal me. It is not going to fix any of my problems. It is only going to present me with the tools I need to deal with those problems myself. But anyway, I hope this video helps or touches you in some way. If it did, if you have book recommendations, or if you have anything else you want to share, leave it in the comments below. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by, and I will see you next time.